I hate to say it, but it's true. The Bible's denial is almost an admission of guilt.
Exactly what role David played in Saul's death, we may never know. But what is clear is that David succeeded him to become Israel's most famous ruler. It's a defining moment in the story of David. It's the first time that the tribes in the north and south have been ruled by one king. The Bible says David begins to formally unify the two regions, the act for which he'll be remembered and celebrated down the centuries. But this unified nation needs a new heart, a new capital to satisfy both north and south. So David chooses an insignificant fortress roughly in the center of the land. He calls his new base the City of David. We know it by another name, Jerusalem.
David could have picked any one of a number of towns in the vicinity of Jerusalem to administer from, but Jerusalem offered the greatest defensive advantages. This was an area from which you could unite two populations, and therefore it was a strategic location to hold and operate from.
But the city was under the control of a hostile people, the Jebusites. And it was never going to be an easy conquest.
Jerusalem was a pretty difficult place to capture. High citadel, strong walls, determined defenders. David is determined to get it. He has got to think his way inside it. Blockade would be terribly long drawn out. Frontal attack would be ruinously expensive in manpower and would demoralize the Israelites. So David looks at the site and thinks, how am I going to get into it? Is there some way up onto the Citadel Mount other than charging at the gates?
David is said to have captured the city in a surprise attack through the town's water systems. And then turned it into a great city full of splendor. But there's a problem with the traditional version of events. Up until the 19th century, no archaeological evidence of the water tunnels had ever been found. The first tantalizing glimpse of a breakthrough came as long ago as 1867, with the discovery of a deep water shaft below Jerusalem. Today, guides lead tourists through this popular site.
A British explorer named Captain Charles Warren comes to this area. He begins exploring the lower Gihon Spring, which is just beneath my feet. 13 meters down in the bottom of this shaft is the Gihon Spring. Captain Charles Warren and his assistant Bertels enter the spring. They crawl through on their knees and enter the area around you. And Warren says to himself, "Behold, I've discovered the shaft used by King David to capture the city."
An exciting discovery, but with a problem. No one could date the tunnel. The pottery fragments needed for dating had been accidentally lost. But a second breakthrough in 1996 by Israeli archaeologist Ronnie Reich yielded the vital missing dates.
We started about 8 years ago, started to dig through and first went through about 8 or 9 meters of the ancient city dump and then landed on these constructions made of huge stones. You can see each one of these stones weighs 2 to 3 tons.
The stones were part of a huge fortification guarding the entrance to the Warren Shaft Spring. Next to them, Ronnie Reich found the essential shards of ancient pottery to date the tunnels.
These stones are associated with pottery, with floors and pottery sherds, and by the pottery we could date them to the Middle Bronze Age too, which is about 3,800 years ago.
That's 1800 BC, proof that the water system existed long before the 10th century when David lived. The discovery was consistent with the story that David and his men crept into Jerusalem through these tunnels.
If anybody could in ancient times climb up these rock walls, which are very steep, very smooth and very high, then this is a possible candidate for his entrance.
The method of attack would have been in keeping with military tactics of the time.
It happens at other places in the ancient world, people getting into cities through water channels, through aqueducts. It is a recognized means of gaining access to a city. So this is an entirely plausible story.
King David and his troops enter the Gihon spring down below, where they wade and run through water, and they're capturing the city. They climb up a vertical shaft into the tunnel we're standing in now, and now they run up the last bit of stairs, entering into the middle of the enemy city. They go up to the guards at the gate, cut their throats, open the gates, and a few attachments of Israelite troops enter the city.
David may well have captured Jerusalem just as tradition says, but the claim that he built a palace there has been much harder to support.
Don't step on this stone.
For despite digging there for over 100 years, the archaeologists have found very little. But there may be a good reason for that.
When we think today of a palace, what do we have in mind? Buckingham Palace in London. Nothing of this type ever has been built here, certainly not in relation with King David. So I imagine that if he has built here a palace, it is not more than a larger private house.
Instead of living in splendor in a great palace, David may have settled for a much humbler dwelling, typical of a village or poor town. Ronnie Reich believes the Bible writers may have attributed more to David's reign than in reality he achieved.
When you are writing a text, well, the sky's the limit to your imagination. You can describe whatever you like. So we have here a contradiction between the text and between what really was created on site.
Throughout the account of his rise to power, the Bible takes great pains to protect David's image. But once he arrives in Jerusalem and becomes king of a unified Israel, the tone changes. For the first time, the Bible is surprisingly open about a major scandal. A mystery scholars are only now beginning to unravel. One of the biblical sources for David records his blatant abuse of power, involving a woman called Bathsheba.
David is at the height of his power, and he's up on the palace wall one evening, and he looks out, and there below him is this beautiful visage, this Bathsheba, in her afternoon bath. Bring me Bathsheba. Bathsheba arrives at the palace, and before we know it, Bathsheba is seduced, Bathsheba is pregnant.
Unfortunately, Bathsheba was already married, and at the time of David, adultery was a crime with serious consequences.
Not only is David in a dicey situation because of his adultery with Bathsheba, but Bathsheba's in a dicey situation. If she has clearly committed adultery, and it is clearly proven, she's in a terrible predicament because she can be stoned to death.
The Bible is also frank about the way David deals with Bathsheba's husband.
The narrator has David bring Bathsheba's husband back from the wars.
Ușoară cele să-i
in an attempt to have him cohabit with his wife, and then one could say that the child that is about to be born is really the child of Bathsheba and Uriah, her husband. But it doesn't work.
Uriah refuses to sleep with Bathsheba while his troops are still out in the field. Although this plan fails, the story says, David soon comes up with another.
David sends Uriah back to his troops with a letter to the other officers there, telling them to put Uriah at the forefront of the battle to make sure that he's killed in battle. And this happens. So David is guilty then of adultery and of murder.
Having worked so hard to build up the character of David, it's puzzling that the writers of the Bible should now begin to reveal his flaws. Steve Mackenzie believes that this could be one occasion where the spin doctors didn't quite have the last word.
The Bathsheba story is kind of a mystery because it's so different from the surrounding material. After the spin doctors have painted their picture of David, then somebody else has come along and inserted this story of Bathsheba in that work. Exactly what the motivations of the person who inserted the Bathsheba story were, I don't know for sure. It may have been a way of saying, this is what happens when you get a king with supreme power. They commit faults. I think the irony is, I love the Bathsheba story. It may be my favorite part. Because he's not the innocent David. He's the David who is guilty of adultery, who has his flaws. But that's the David that we identify with.
The Bible writers may well have believed that David's reputation could withstand a bit of scandal. After all, he had achieved what must have seemed like an impossible feat: the unification of Israel. The irony is that today scholars are less sure that David did truly unify the country. The incident that casts the most doubt on David's achievements is a revolt. Led by the king's own son, Absalom.
The beauty of the Absalom revolt in historical terms is that it shows us that David was hugely unpopular. The entire population of Judah and Israel rise up against him. This man was hated, widely hated, and probably did not have widespread control of the countryside at the time.
The Bible plays down the revolt, blaming it all, in a rather modern twist, on poor parenting skills. It hints that it was David's leniency towards his children that enabled Absalom to rebel.
I think that the way that the spin doctors are using that element is to paint this portrait of David as gentle. Somebody who's too gentle to harm anyone certainly would not harm his own son.
The image of a gentle David makes some scholars doubly suspicious, because just as the revolt is stopped, Absalom is killed on the battlefield.
The reason why I'm suspicious at that point is because we have the same pattern here that we had with some of the earlier figures who stood in David's way. Namely, somebody dies violently, the text goes to lengths to say David had nothing to do with it, and when David finds out about it, he mourns profusely. That's exactly what happens with Absalom. And so, again, I think David is probably the one who's ultimately behind it.
The death of Absalom is a good indication of just how David held on to power.
The biblical story portrays the unification of Israel as an elective process. The people